Okay, guys, we'll make a start. Just before we begin, could I ask everyone to put their mics on silent, except for obviously Rowan and Peter, who will be presenting for us. It just helps with any background noise. That'd be fab. So we're really lucky tonight. We've got our colleagues, Rowan Henthorn and Dr. Peter Duncan, who are going to present the presentation for us on blue carbon, the sea's contribution to fighting climate change. So I've been really excited about this one and I'm really looking forward to it. I hope you enjoy it. And what we'll do, we'll let Rowan and Peter do their presentation and we'll ask questions at the end. Depending on our numbers, we might use the chat function again, or we might be sort of do might be okay for you guys to just ask freely like we used to. So what me and Rose will do, we'll see how many people we have online at the end of the presentation. As always, these things are always really, we're quite free with these. If we have any Wi-Fi issues, if kids burst in, dogs come bursting, we'll just keep calm and carry on like we usually do. Okay, without further ado, I shall hand over to Peter and Rowan.
Okay, thank you very much. We will just share our screen and hopefully that will work. So can everyone see that okay?
Yep, all good, Peter.
Oh, we just the cleaner is going to come in and clean the room. So hi everybody, and thank you so much for joining us on this rather cold and miserable autumnal night. I'd say that wherever you're listening from, whether that's your living room or wherever, is probably the best place to learn about the marine environment rather than being out in it tonight. So we are going to talk to you a bit about the Manx Blue Carbon Project and how our seas can help contribute to fighting climate change. I'm going to try and use the mouse to guide us. Just to give you a quick overview of what we're going to be talking about, so my colleague Peter Duncan is going to talk a little bit about our Manx Territorial Sea and actually our history of Manx marine science, which is really rich and interesting, and then to talk a little bit about our marine habitats and species, and about the blue carbon concept in itself and the carbon cycle and how our marine environment interacts with that. I'm then going to talk a bit about blue carbon in the context of international climate policy, and talk to you a little bit about our potential for blue carbon in the Isle of Man, which has led to our Manx Blue Carbon Project. I'll talk to you about our approach for the project and our project partners, and we'll talk to you a bit about where we're at the moment and what our next steps are, and we'll have time at the end for all of your questions. So I'll hand over to Peter.
Okay, thank you. As Rowan said, I think I say fully understand blue carbon is a fairly new concept to most of us, but to fully understand the concepts, where it comes from and how it relates to the Isle of Man, we thought we would start right at the beginning and give you a bit of an introduction about the Isle of Man Territorial Sea and how it's managed and administered, and the background to the kind of scientific data that will be required for a project such as this. So just to start off with, the Isle of Man Territorial Sea goes out to about 12 nautical miles and it covers an area of 4,000 square kilometres. So it's in area size, it's an awful lot bigger than the island itself. And in that sense, in the context of managing carbon, it represents a significant opportunity, if you like. From a management perspective, the Isle of Man government owns the seabed out to 12 nautical miles and the resources that exist in it and on it, although curiously not exclusively the fisheries resources, which are a little bit more complicated than that. Now, the responsibility for managing the territorial sea is split between several departments. Notably, Department of Infrastructure is actually responsible for the seabed and the non-living resources that live on it, as well as managing depositions onto the seabed. And DEFA, to which we belong, manage the living resources of the sea under two different pieces of legislation, the Wildlife Act and the Fisheries Act. And DEFA also jointly manage the Water Pollution Act out to 3 miles. Now, to put it in context, what blue carbon relates to really requires an understanding of how the seabed and its resources are managed. So that's really the reason that that's in there. And just to give you a slightly wider context, this is a recent map of the territorial sea and its regional context, and really how much goes on the seabed that we don't realise, and therefore the importance of engaging regionally with our neighbours and partners. And as I'll get on to talk about, thinking about the spatial distribution of things so that we can run projects such as blue carbon in the context of all of the other things that go on in our waters. Okay, so a project such as this really is fundamentally based in science, and the Isle of Man has a long history of marine science, and I hesitate to say it, but we have quite a lot of data and a reasonable understanding of Manx waters and what goes on in them. I say I hesitate to say it because there is an awful lot out there, and much of it we still have to learn. Now, those data sources can date back quite a considerable time, more than 100 years, and they originate from things like the Port Erin Marine Lab, which many of you know about, subsequently Bangor University and various other universities that have done work in our waters. DEFA undertake, and other government departments undertake various surveys, including mapping, etc. Fishing industry can provide data. NGOs such as Manx Wildlife Trust, Sea Search, etc. Provide data about the marine environment. And there are various infrastructure projects, whether it's laying cables or pipelines, etc., that provide data about seabed habitats and depth and the types of organisms that live there. And just to give you an example of a few pieces of data that we have that you'll see the context of in terms of blue carbon. The top graphic there shows sea surface temperature recorded at Port Erin, and it shows you the mean, the maximum, and the minimum temperature over one season. Now, if you collect the same sort of data over 100 years, such as in the bottom graphic, what you see is the trend in temperature over a long period of time, over summer, etc. And what you can see actually in the last few decades has been an actual increase in sea surface temperatures. Now, that's really important when you're trying to understand concepts of blue carbon. Similarly, fisheries surveys, for example, go out and they survey abundance and distribution of things like scallops or queen scallops, and the top one is a scallop distribution map of the territorial sea. And when you add that to fisheries activity, fishing activity based on satellite tracking of fishing boats, and you overlay that on top of distributions, then you can map things like where the scallop beds are and the activity, the relative levels of activity associated with boats on them. Again, I'll show you how that's important later on. And lastly, fairly basic stuff. These data came from Manx Basking Shark Watch, and they're simply public sightings records of basking sharks around the coast. Now, in itself, that's important if you want to understand where they are and the interactions that may result from that. But they can also form the basis of more sophisticated work, such as satellite tagging of basking sharks, which shows in the bottom graphic that actually their distribution is much further up the coast than people see, partly because there are fewer people and partly because they might be doing different things. So all of these various pieces of data can start to provide a picture. Talking specifically about one of the important blue carbon species and habitats is eelgrass. I will talk about that in a bit more detail, but relatively straightforward surveys looking at the bottom of Ramsay Bay in a transect in a line using drop-down cameras, we can see how eelgrass is actually extended further out from the existing eelgrass protection zone. And by mapping that with modern techniques, you can actually start to quantify the extent of a habitat like that. So looking at that in a little bit more detail, we have basic survey data. In the case of the graphic here, this is horse mussels and how they're distributed around the territorial sea. And those data have been collected over many decades. And similarly, another potentially important blue carbon species, which is merle, which is a coralline algae. We can plot that on a map and work out where the actual distributions of those organisms are. If we join that together on a territorial sea scale, then we can see the area, not only the total distribution of habitats and species, and see how perhaps that changes over time, but also the area that covers. We can extrapolate between those sites, and we can come up with a map like that, which essentially shows the distribution of different types of seabed habitat around the territorial sea. Now, that's a really useful thing basic data to start off with. And if we analyze a little bit further, we can start to classify those habitat types in a way which is internationally recognized. And that means that if we collect data on the carbon content of any particular habitat, we can compare it to published data from other parts of Europe, for example. So it makes it more usable to other people, as well as putting it in a format that everyone understands. Another opportunity that there is if you look at, say, all your important conservation species, of which 5 of them are mapped here, and you overlay that with fishing activity records, then you can see whether there are interactions between different activities in the territorial sea. Now, some of those interactions don't particularly affect each other. When I say interactions within the same area, but some interactions can be actually detrimental to one or the other. So scallop dredging, for example, can break up the seabed surface. It can dislodge species and habitats, etc. So you might want to know where those interactions are in order to manage them better. And so what we're really talking about there is the beginnings of spatial management within the territorial sea. And I'll give you a couple of examples of how spatial management actually operates. So knowing where things are, habitats or species, and the amount of them or the extent of them is really important, fundamental to any sort of management. An analogy would be forests or farming, for example. You need to know where things are so that you can plan accordingly. And you can use that spatial management for all sorts of things, whether it's for conservation purposes or avoiding conflicts between all the many different activities that go on in our waters, or for strategic planning, of which a blue carbon project such as this is an example. So the map that's shown there is based on annual scallop surveys which show where juvenile scallops are, for example. Because you want those juvenile scallops to grow up to be harvestable, you may put a closed area around them to stop boats fishing them for a year or so until they've grown up. So that's quite a simple example of resource management using the powers that the government have. Similarly, you can do the same thing if you know your distributions of conservation or blue carbon species. You can put boundaries around them and control what happens in them. And so we now have 10 marine nature reserves which cover just over 10% of the whole territorial sea. And within them, various activities can be managed in order to get the most out of the particular features that exist within them. And even within marine nature reserves such as that, depending on what you're trying to achieve, the occurrence and distributions of different species, you can manage them through zoning plans. And Ramsay Bay has 5 different zones which are set up in order to manage different activities and, as I said, maximize the benefits, if you like, from those different features. I mentioned eelgrass before, which is, as Rowan will talk about in a minute, is an important blue carbon resource, and they have a specific conservation status and rules and regulations governing them within the Marine Nature Reserve. So by knowing where they are, mapping their extent, you can protect them and use them for various purposes, or not use them, protect them and conserve them as appropriate. And I'll just use eelgrass as an example, but you can extrapolate the concept to any of the habitats and species that Rowan will talk about in a minute. So eelgrass is probably the best known. It's the one that hits the papers the most in the media, is talked about. It's actually eelgrass or seagrass. There's various species around the world, but we only have one as far as we know. It's a marine flowering plant, which is kind of unusual. It's not a typical kelp or algae. And so, like most flowering plants, it actually has seeds. Now, this is important when we talk about things like restoring or restoration of habitats such as this. And they live in shallow, sandy seabeds. They're important for stabilizing the seabed. They're important nursery habitats for various species. And as you're probably aware, they're important in terms of absorbing nutrients and carbon. And Rowan will talk about that a little bit later. So at the moment, we have actually 5 known sites, 4 of which are in marine nature reserves. And the data that provides that information comes from various sources, which I mentioned before, and they have particular legal status. A few years ago, and those maps I showed earlier show the extent of that survey, we recognized that the area of protection that we have at the moment probably wasn't sufficient for the extent that eelgrass actually was. So using the Barul and a drop-down camera, we actually mapped the extent of seagrass a little bit more in this area, and then using GIS techniques, we extrapolated in between them, and so we can start to work out an area of eelgrass as it is now, and not how it was originally designated in 2011. So the application of techniques allows us to update data as we go along. And similarly, we can look backwards in time and see where some of these potential blue carbon habitats existed before. This is Port Erin Bay. So in the south and in the north of the bay, eelgrass existed. And the picture below, actually it was Fiona Gell, who's on the call tonight, who provided that. That's a specimen of it washed up. And actually we still don't know where that came from. So there's probably a few areas in there, but the fact that knowing that there was a former historic distribution of something like that opens up opportunities for protection and enhancement and restoration, which we'll talk about shortly. I thought, because we do hear quite a lot about eelgrass, I'd actually show you quite a nice little video of that, which was taken by Lara Howe of the Manx Wildlife Trust, and this is in Ramsay Bay and forms part of that quite extensive area that we have. It's by far the biggest area within the territorial sea, but it gives you a concept. So the idea of it being something of an underwater meadow is quite appropriate. So I've mentioned blue carbon, and it's probably worth, before Rowan talks about the project in more detail, to tell you a little bit of the theoretical background of that. So to put it simply, blue carbon is carbon within the marine environment. And as we all know, oceans cover about 70% of the Earth's surface, contain almost all of the Earth's water. And various elements and compounds are dissolved within them, including the gases which are in the atmosphere. Now, the concentrations of gases are obviously not the same in the atmosphere as they are in water, but they essentially form an equilibrium, a balance between them. So what happens in the atmosphere can change the concentrations of gases that are dissolved within water. And just to give you a concept, because it's about 70% of the Earth's surface, it's estimated that around 30% of all of the carbon dioxide emitted since the start of the Industrial Revolution a few hundred years ago has actually been absorbed by the ocean. So what it represents is a massive pool of actual and potentially stored carbon. And we're kind of fond of putting things in terms of blue whale units. The actual active pool of carbon within the Earth's surface is about 40,000 gigatons, the equivalent, if you can imagine it, of 240 billion blue whales. But 95% of that carbon, that active pool of carbon, is stored within the oceans. So as I said, it represents a massive pool of potential storage, and therefore it becomes important in carbon management strategies. I won't go into massive detail about it. Suffice to say that I guess blue carbon can be considered in three different components. There's three pools or cycles of carbon within the sea. The first one is relatively straightforward, is straightforward carbon dioxide dissolved in seawater. And as I said, that forms an equilibrium. It can come into solution and can go out of solution. But interestingly, in the context of increasing temperatures in the sea, warm water holds less carbon dioxide. So I'd like to make the point of thinking about things like temperature and, as I'll talk about in a minute, acidity or pH, in the context of how much carbon we can actually store in the sea. The middle one here, the biological cycle, if you like, is really the one that we're probably most familiar with, whereby carbon dioxide is taken up by plants and it feeds into a fairly standard food chain. So by eating plants, higher organisms store carbon in their bodies. Some of those bodies eventually become sediments at the bottom of the sea. Some of them decay by bacterial action and release carbon dioxide as well. And respiration of all of those organisms actually produces carbon dioxide. So we need to think of carbon dioxide in the sea as being a dynamic pool. So it does come and go, which is important to say. The last one, which is a little bit more complicated, and I hasten to add, I'm not a chemist, but it is really important to understand this and how it links in. And I'll flip on to this next slide, which I grant you looks really, really horrible, but it's not as bad as it looks. Basically, this is a diagram of it. You've got carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which is the one that we all hear about, the various sources of carbon dioxide. It interacts with water, seawater, and it forms one of three different types. So the first one is carbonic acid. The second one is bicarbonate, and the third one is carbonate. Now, carbon can basically transfer between all of those different states depending on seawater chemistry and various other parameters. And to put it in that context, because the pH of the ocean is around about here, 90+% of carbon stores in seawater is bicarbonate. Okay, if seawater becomes more acidic, the carbonic acid fraction tends to dominate, and if seawater becomes less acidic, then you get more carbonate formed. So those three different things can sort of shuttle between each other depending on the circumstances that appear in the sea. Now, really importantly, when you add atmospheric carbon dioxide to the sea and it shuttles between these different species, you end up producing hydrogen ions. Now, hydrogen ions are what drive pH changes. So more hydrogen ions in the water makes the sea more acidic. When we look at global trends in carbon dioxide increasing in the atmosphere, we're actually seeing a similar increase in carbon dioxide going into the sea. And as I just mentioned, the more carbon dioxide you put into the sea, the more hydrogen ions, and therefore the pH of the water drops, it becomes more acidic. And that's the concept of ocean acidification. And we need to think of it in those terms. What's really interesting is that decline here, even over the 50, 60 years or so that it's been measured, there's very little carbonate below a pH of about 7.5. Now, we're not there yet, but the more acidic the water is, the less carbonate is held in it. Why is that important? Because so many of the different organisms that we rely on for food or for biological services or for blue carbon are actually carbonate based. So the more acidic the ocean becomes, the less we can rely on it as a means of, ironically, absorbing more carbon in the forms that we use. Okay, so what we're saying is increasing global temperatures, including in the water, increasing acidification, are actually at odds with what we're trying to do in terms of storing carbon in the sea. And so we need to think about all of these things holistically. We can't rely on blue carbon, for example, to solve our problems. We need to think about carbon dioxide emissions as well. So just to summarize this part of the talk, we can't affect massively carbon management in the ocean just because of the scale of it. So blue carbon in itself will not resolve all of our problems. It has to be part of a wider strategy, which fundamentally includes reducing carbon emissions, atmospheric carbon dioxide levels, basically. Blue carbon is a really important component of a comprehensive carbon management plan, which is what you see on the island. But as I said at the beginning, it's not going to resolve all of it. And secondly, partly due to the scales and partly due to the fact that it's a new activity, if you like, we're going to have to work collaboratively with regional partners and internationally in order to make our contribution count in the global scale. Okay. So that's all I have to say. Hopefully that wasn't too horrendous. Chemistry at 7:30 in the evening is a bit of a worry. But Rowan will go on to talk specifically about how all of that fed into the development of the project and putting it into its wider context.
Perfect. Thank you, Peter. And I'll just have a sip of my cold tea. Anybody who's more lucky than me drinking wine and learning about blue carbon, do so. So yeah, Peter talked a bit about that carbon cycle and how blue carbon habitats fit into that and how they interact with our atmosphere. And I thought it was a good place to start to talk about some of our key blue carbon habitats on the Isle of Man. So as Peter said, we have seagrass, which are a really interesting group of marine plants that actually flower. And there's some research coming out that says, is looking at whether actually fish and crustaceans that live in that habitat actually work the same way as pollinators on land and help to pollinate plants. We have salt marsh, a small amount of salt marsh on the island. So I don't know if you've been to Cornay, up in that kind of river system, or Pool Dewey and Ramsey. Then we also have extensive kelp beds around the island, and they're a little bit different to those other kind of habitats because they kind of work on an annual rate. They die back in the winter and then grow in the summer. And for a long time, they weren't considered an important part of that blue carbon system. But new research is actually realizing that they are, because I mean, when you walk on the beach in the winter and you see those big piles of seaweed, you kind of imagine that must be all the seaweed in the marine environment, but actually it's only a small percentage, and they think around 30% of the seaweed that gets ripped up by the storms actually makes its way into the deep ocean, and once it goes past a certain depth, that carbon is locked in there forever and it can't get back into the environment. So it shows how significant it is. Then you've got merle, which is this pink coralline algae, and as you can see, it's really important, not only for its carbon storage, but also for its biodiversity potential. You can see all those creatures living in that really complex 3D habitat. And then you have the echinoderms. So echinoderms means spiky skin, derm meaning skin, and you see these in rich mats of brittle stars on the seabed. They kind of look like this crazy alien world. And then you have horse mussel reefs and the really super sexy blue carbon habitat, which is fine muddy sediment and sand, which is definitely not as glamorous as your seagrasses and kelps, but is actually a really significant store of carbon. And when you consider how much of our marine environment is actually that kind of muddy sediment, it really kind of comes into its own. So I thought I'd give a little bit of context as to how we are talking about blue carbon today and why it's important from a policy perspective in terms of our response to climate change. And it's really rapidly becoming a really key area of research and therefore policy globally. In 2013, the IPCC report provided guidelines for the inclusion of blue carbon ecosystems in their wetlands supplement, which included tidal marsh, seagrass, and mangroves. And then in 2016, the Paris Agreement called for countries to actively protect blue carbon ecosystems. And as of 2019, 29 nations include blue carbon in their NDCs. But I imagine coming up to this COP, many other nations will be including them because the research is just moving at such a rapid rate, and people are really starting to learn a lot more about these ecosystems in terms of their carbon storage and sequestration potential. Now, I mentioned tidal marsh, seagrass, and mangroves, but they are not the only important blue carbon habitats, even though they're the ones that the IPCC recognize as emission, kind of in their emission guidelines. Those other really important ones are kelp, marine sediment, merle, biogenic reefs, and the IPCC states that these kind of habitats should definitely not be overlooked because they're really important in terms of their management and restoration potential. And it's also really interesting because blue carbon has a role to play as technology develops for our zero carbon future. Take kelp, for example, which is a really interesting plant species that grows really fast and has real potential for biomass, whether that's in terms of biofuel, having low carbon fuels, or fertilizers and food in our kind of transition to a zero carbon future. So the UK recently put out a policy note about the importance of blue carbon, and they actually estimated that UK carbon sequestration was around 11 million tons of CO2 per year, which is huge, and that the value of that habitat of that carbon sequestration and storage was around £57.5 billion annually. So really, really significant. And I mean, you could probably tell me this, it's pretty straightforward, but researchers have found that actually managing and protecting these ecosystems now is far, far cheaper than the costs associated with the impact of these degraded ecosystems in the future. And this kind of isn't just a research and kind of policy in the ether of marine management. This kind of research is being put into practice. The Scottish Blue Carbon Forum recently formed, and they're doing lots of amazing research to inform policy, especially in those kind of habitats, cold marine habitats like kelp and marine sediment, which are really useful for us. The NGO, the Blue Marine Foundation, which are a really fantastic non-government organisation, and I suggest you check them out if you found this at all interesting, because they do some really exciting projects, and they're doing a blue carbon project down in Jersey. And then there's the Life Remedies project, which are doing the largest seagrass restoration in the whole of the UK. They're trying to restore 6 hectares of seagrass, and that's a EU-funded project. And there's a really cool project called Sea Wilding up in the Lochs of Scotland, and that's a really community-based project. It's completely community-led, and it's this fantastic guy restoring native oysters and seagrass in the lochs up in Scotland. So there's lots of exciting projects going on, and that's just a small number of the ones in the UK, and hopefully ours can be amongst that list in a year's time. So how did we start looking at Ardbank's blue carbon potential? So as I'm sure you guys all know, as fantastic members of the Citizens Forum, that Professor James Curran came and wrote an impact report for us in 2019, and I was actually part of the analytical team, and part of my role was to look at the potential for blue carbon in our waters. Now, we didn't have a lot of time to put our information together, but we were really lucky that we had a master's thesis that looked at the potential for blue carbon in our waters, and that was Rachel Towell's dissertation. So she did some fantastic work collating a lot of our existing data, and one of the key pieces of research was a habitat survey that was done by Bangor University in 2008. And they went around the island and did various drop downs and kind of collated a lot of data about the kind of marine species and habitat we can find around the Isle of Man. So you can see here there's sort of starfish and echinoderms, but all this grey area on the west coast is actually full of nephrops, which are kind of a langoustine species. So they're all in that kind of sexy blue carbon mud I was talking about earlier. And then you have lots of scallop grounds and obviously brittle stars, and she also looked at the kind of habitats. So you've got the sand and the kelp and the merle and the seagrass, and she used this existing habitat data and compiled more data from kind of in situ surveys from divers, to build up a really good idea of what our marine environment looks like. She then used some of that fantastic work that Scotland are doing on their value. They did a load of work basically putting carbon values on certain habitat types. So she looked at those values and kind of scaled it to how much area we had. And her results found that approximately our blue carbon habitats sequester approximately 200,000 tons of carbon per year, which, to put that into some context, is about 25% of our annual island emissions. So really significant in terms of our emissions, and estimated that storage is somewhere between 1.5 and 36 megatons of carbon per year. But that kind of highlights the need to do some additional work to kind of get that range down to somewhere that's not quite so large. The work found that there was obviously presence of seagrass and salt marsh, which is really important in terms of our reporting for our IPCC and the Paris Agreement. And then also found that marine sediment was a really important habitat, was a really important kind of sediment source of carbon, and that kelp and merle were also really significant habitats on the island. So overall, the study found that there was real significant potential in our waters for blue carbon management and potentially restoration. And as Peter mentioned before, you know, as an island with 85% of our territory in the marine environment, it makes complete strategic sense to manage and maximize our seas in terms of their climate mitigation and adaptation. And when you think about that, you know, globally and especially in the UK, we've lost almost 90% of some habitats. So for our seagrass, it's estimated that we've lost 90% of seagrass beds over the last 100 years. It shows that there is real potential to increase our blue carbon resource through the right management and restoration. And on top of that is the reality that managing our seas for blue carbon is likely to be one of the cheapest ways to enhance our carbon capture, whilst also delivering a huge array of other ecological, economic and social benefits. So those findings and the impact report followed on from that was our Council of Ministers Phase 1 action plan, and they came up with the action to develop a comprehensive blue carbon management plan that maximises carbon sequestration and maintains and restores related biodiversity and wider ecosystem services. And with that, the Manx Blue Carbon Project was born. So we broke down the Council of Ministers action into a number of objectives. And that was to obviously overall to develop a management plan based on an ecosystem approach that maximised carbon sequestration in the Isle of Man territorial seas. So how do you go about that? That seems like a pretty big goal to do. Well, first of all, we need to know exactly what we've got. So that builds on the work, Rachel's work, to kind of quantify our area and work out what those blue carbon resources are doing and how much carbon they're sequestering and storing. And then to look at the potential risks to that existing habitat and seeing how we can mitigate that where possible. Then we also want to look at proof of concept projects. So looking at small projects and seeing how that we can change our management of our seas and how we can potentially restore areas to maximise that carbon. And then we can implement that in phase 2 of our project. Now, our secondary goals, we have one that is looking to restore biodiversity. So as we've kind of mentioned throughout, these habitats aren't just important for the carbon, they're actually really important for biodiversity as well. And we know there's a climate crisis, but there's also an ecological crisis. So managing these systems in this way, it's actually got multiple benefits. And the way we do that is obviously to first quantify the biodiversity that's provided by our habitats, and then to establish an appropriate baseline so that we actually can monitor how well we're doing in terms of our management and restoration and how that changes throughout time. And we have to do the same for ecosystem services. So blue carbon habitats also provide a number of really important ecosystem services. And ecosystem services are basically the services provided, like the air we breathe or clean water. They actually provide storm protection and coastal protection and act as like nursery grounds for commercially important species. So they provide a lot of benefits. So it's making sure that we're managing and protecting those ecosystem services as well. And there you go. I just put that one there because you can actually see some of the small fish from the seagrass bed there. So our approach, we're going to do this project hopefully over 3 years, but in 2 phases. And we have an overarching PhD research project over that 3-year period. Because this is a really new area of research and science, we knew from the start that it was critically important to get the right academic partners on board with us, so we could make sure that we're at the forefront of this field. So we've got some fantastic partners that I'll mention in a minute. And really our first year, this next 12-month period, is really about quantifying that blue carbon potential and auditing our seas, making sure we're filling in those gaps from that 2008 survey and building up a really good detailed picture of what we've got and how much carbon it's storing and sequestering. And then from that, if we think that there is significant opportunity, which we hope there will be in terms of enhancing our carbon storage and sequestration, we'll move on to really building a really good management plan that will help to maximize the blue carbon in our seas. So I mentioned proof of concept projects before, and those are kind of small projects that can really show how much potential there is, and we'll really be focusing on those in the first year as well. And one of those is that muddy habitat that we spoke about earlier, where at the moment we have a lot of boats from outside of our waters coming to fish for nephrops, and actually there's quite limited management in terms of the fishery. So we're going to work with our fisheries teams to see how that management could potentially be tweaked to make sure that whilst also being productive, we could manage that area for its carbon storage as well. Now Rachel's dissertation also looked at our marine nature reserve network and found that actually a lot of our blue carbon resources are actually already protected in those marine nature reserves. So one of our other proof of concept projects is really to look at how we can maximize the blue carbon that's already protected in those areas through tweaks to management or potential restoration projects. So we have some really fantastic partners involved in the project. So we have the National Oceanographic Centre, which are based down in Southampton, and they've done some really interesting work in Belize, looking at their blue carbon potential. They have like the second biggest reef system in the world, but they're finding that through changes of land use through agriculture, that's actually affecting their coastal environment. So NOC has been doing some fantastic work on blue carbon there, and they're really excited to work with us. I think one of the really exciting things about the Isle of Man is that although we're small, and a lot of people think that that's a good reason to not do anything on climate change, actually it's the complete opposite, because of our size, we have the potential to look at the whole system, and actually that could be scaled up to bigger countries. So we can act as this really exciting test bed for new ideas, and that's why NOC are really excited to work with us. And we also have Swansea University, and then you can see Dr. Richard Unsworth there doing some seagrass restoration, and they are real world leaders in seagrass restoration. And then we also have Bangor University, who have been long-term academic partners with us, and they do really interesting work on fisheries management. We also have local partners that we're excited to work with, and that's the Manx Wildlife Trust, who've been doing bits on seagrass restoration, and they manage the Sea Search project, so they collect really important work for us. And obviously, as a biosphere, we are really keen for this to be a really holistic project that works across all areas of the community. So I'm hoping this has inspired you to come to our community events in the future. Now, as Peter and I have kind of said throughout, there are a lot of considerations to make this a success, and it's really key that this project is embedded in decision making across government. It has to be aligned with marine spatial planning. And when you think about our response to climate change, we are potentially putting a lot more stress on our marine environment, whether that comes to renewable energy generation, new pipelines and cables. So we need to make sure that we're working with lots of other stakeholders and marine users to make sure that we are creating space for nature to do its thing. We also want to work with lots of stakeholders, including our largest habitual user of the marine environment, which is the fishing industry, and making sure that we can work in a way that works for both areas, because humans are part of nature at the end of the day, and we need to all work together to be sustainable. And yeah, it will require a collaboration with regional and international partners. And Peter made this point before, but it's important to note again that this is a really exciting project that's got lots of benefits for the environment and for our community, but it's no silver bullet solution, and it's no substitute for substantial emissions reductions, which obviously has to happen on land as well. But we are in a really unique position to be a leader in small scale blue carbon management. We have a really good history of science-based fisheries management, and we have a network of relatively highly protected marine areas. So we're already getting off on a fantastic start. Our next steps, we're in the process of recruiting an internal blue carbon team, and we'll be working with our partners and doing a workshop by the end of October, with the hope of starting our project around January this year, which kind of aligns with our PhD student and works well with our survey season, which is in the kind of summer season. And yeah, just to say that we're really excited to work on this project, and we hope that it can be a really holistic, innovative approach to research. And thank you for taking the time to listen on this kind of dreary autumn night. And if you have any questions, we would be more than happy to try and answer them for you.
Thank you so much, Rowan and Peter. I really enjoyed that, and I'm definitely going to come along to your community events. So that'll be really good. Thank you so much. That was really interesting. Right, guys. What we'll do, we'll go through our old-fashioned way of asking questions. There's not many of us online, so if you want to raise your hand, I will come to you and you can ask Rowan and Peter your questions. So, Carol, I've got you up first. Would you like to ask Rowan and Peter your question?
Okay, thank you very much. I really enjoyed that. It was really interesting. Thank you both very much. The question I was going to ask was, you talked about Ramsey quite a lot and about the grasses and the merle that's up there. I'm wondering if you've done a survey, or has anybody looked at what's going to happen or what will change once the new Ramsey Marina happens? It seems to be, it's going to be quite big from the looks of it, from what I've seen of the planning, and that I would imagine is going to affect the seabed at some stage.
Yeah, I could probably comment on it to some extent.
Well, how you guys, for the protection, the conservation of the area is what I was worried about, because it seems to be one of the main areas of conservation that we have around the island.
Yeah, I mean, it is a marine nature reserve, so it has specific features that were used to designate it, and therefore it's worthy of protection under law. It is important to know, I know there's been a lot of publicity about the proposed marina recently. There is no formal planning application in, and as and when that happens, it would be accompanied by an environmental impact assessment. So
that's good.
Until such times as there is a planning application, it's a little bit difficult to talk about it specifically. However, the principles that you're basically mentioning and the fact that it is a marine nature reserve would mean that any application and an environmental impact assessment would need to consider potential impacts on the features that are designated in Ramsey. And given the importance, the increasing importance of blue carbon, it would likely be considered in the context of blue carbon impacts as well. I'm not certain how that might be managed, but you could imagine something like a blue carbon audit and an offsetting plan. But it's a long way to go. It's a potentially significant development, and in fact there is no formal planning application in. So I hope that answers it.
Yes, no, that's fine. That was fine.
Yeah.
I wasn't sure how far they'd gone down the route, and I was just wondering if they had already applied for it. Had anybody even thought about looking at the conservation side of it or anything like that?
It will be absolutely fundamental. I mean, that's essentially my job. So it will be absolutely. But the role of the sea, what this talk and the research that's going into it is emphasizing, is that while we perhaps used to think of the sea as a big grey wobbly thing that we could do whatever we wanted in, it's actually fundamental to, as Rowan said, ecosystem services, what the sea does for us, and actually the costs that would be incurred if it stopped doing that for us. It's actually quite surprising. So you have to factor all of these considerations in. And when we look at, you'll see that the Blue Carbon Project, as one example, incorporates the protection of habitats and species as well as the blue carbon. You can't separate each of the components. They all interact together. And I think increasingly we're recognizing that we can't manage things in isolation. We need to look at them holistically. You can't even manage blue carbon without thinking about ocean acidification or about sea temperature changes. They are all interrelated. So we can't manage things in silos. They have to be thought of collectively.
Okay, yeah, that's brilliantly. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you, Carol. Guys, is there any more questions for Rowan and Peter? Oh, I have a hand raised there. Who is David? Would you like to ask Rowan and Peter your question?
I see the Isle of Man is in a brilliant position to deal with carbon dioxide. What is going to be the origin of the methane that you are going to be using to produce the blue hydrogen?
Can you give a bit more clarity about what you mean by blue hydrogen?
Well, you're talking about blue carbon, so you're just talking about sequestrating the carbon dioxide.
Yep.
So my concern is it's going to be the origin of the hydrogen. That I get the impression this is not your remit. Is that correct?
So we're talking about carbon sequestration and storage by natural habitats in the marine ecosystem.
Right.
So it's a naturally occurring process, and we have removed, up to 90% of some of those habitats. So it's basically restoring a natural process. And as far as I'm aware, and I know some wetlands can have different gases that are released, such as methane. But as far as I'm aware, most blue carbon habitats don't release methane into the atmosphere.
Right, so I think I've got the wrong people to ask the question. I have to wait for another webinar on the production of blue hydrogen, I think. Sorry. But fantastic.
I think it relates. I think it probably relates to alternative energy sources. So as Rowan said, I do think we need to consider adding to the problems by managing the resources that we have. Alternative energy sources is certainly one of them, and it has to be balanced against current ideas of or current usage of hydrocarbons or alternative of types of fuel. But I think you're right. It comes into energy policy and what specifically would be using as a base for production of energy in the future.
Yeah, because I don't say my worry is adding extra water vapor to atmospheric processes. But I can see I've got to ask a question to another group of people. But yeah, brilliant talk.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ant. Guys, we've just got a couple of questions on the chat. I've just got one here saying, hi, could I ask what the community projects will involve? Will it be for divers only, or will you need lots of volunteers? It's a great question.
So we are kind of at the planning stages at the moment. So, everything is kind of up to be decided, and we'd love to involve the community as much as possible. And I mean, there's some fantastic examples of community initiatives that we're definitely looking into. We will definitely rely on work from Sea Search, which are a community group, and we've used their data in the past. And I think Wildlife Trust have been doing training for people that are interested in getting involved with Sea Search, and you can do that either as a diver or as a snorkeler. So there's options for being involved in research in that area. Is there anything else that you can think of, Peter?
Yeah, we are at the beginning of this process, and typically with something like this, we would certainly look to engage community. There's various stakeholders that we talked about, whether it's fishing industry or energy producers or whatever it might be. But I absolutely don't see any reason why the community shouldn't become involved in this. And so in some respects, because we're just starting off with this, I'd be encouraging, and part of the reason that we do this kind of webinar is about A, letting people know what we're doing, and B, letting people know where this concept sits in the wider scheme of things. And so we'd certainly be encouraging engagement from the community. And you know where we live, so if you have ideas about it, this is not a short term. It won't be over in a year, and it won't be over in 3 years. We have no idea how far it's going to go, but I think the opportunity for community involvement in it will certainly increase over the years. But it is a work in progress. So please get in touch if you have ideas that we can incorporate it. And just one other point, we have had a specific objective to achieve, as Rowan outlined, so that the scope of the project, while it's certainly wide, is not completely exhaustive. And I think as we work through the first few years of a project like this, new options will develop and ideas will come to fruition. One of the interesting things, I'm working with local groups like the Wildlife Trust, for example, that will be I suspect there'll be a very good conduit for working with the public in it. So whether it's manhandling seagrass shoots from one place to another, or filling sandbags which we put eelgrass seeds into in order to restore these habitats. Who knows, but I can certainly imagine there'll be a requirement for people.
And I think that's part of you know, being part of a biosphere, and it's all about engaging with people and the environment and the relationship between that. So I think we're really, really keen to have as much community involvement as we can, and it's exciting to hear that people are even asking those questions initially. So yeah, watch this space and come to us.
Thanks, guys. I just want to go back to David, because he's just typed his question. Have you spoke to the local dive groups to assist in gathering existing data on local habitats? Have they been helpful?
So the most coordinated group is Sea Search, which is a specifically trained group of recreational divers that complete survey forms, and that goes into a massive database. And in answer to that question, yes, it's been phenomenally helpful. I think a degree of coordination is important, because then you end up with the right kind of data. But I think it's a good example of the last question. Divers are fundamentally important to a lot of the data that we collect that will go into running this project into the future. So it's a case of let's talk about these sorts of things. But Sea Search and the Manx Wildlife Trust would be a good place to start, because surveys, I mentioned during my presentation that we found, so a group of divers have found a new eelgrass meadow. Okay, it's coordinated through Wildlife Trust and through Sea Search, but that kind of anecdotal information leads us to enhance the data that we have. So divers are particularly useful and have been in the past.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Peter. Any other questions, guys, for Rowan and Peter? Raise your hand or use the chat function.
Did David sort out his...
Yes, that last question was from David. So
I mean, you know, it's interesting. It's quite expensive to run boats and move them up and down the coast and get them launched and all the rest of it. And while government have certainly helped in funding these things, it's likely to become more relevant. And so I think what's really important is whether you're a diver or not, an awareness of the issues, and to some degree a little bit of training and understanding, so that you know what you're looking at and you can report back to the right people. So I think this sort of group is really important. So spread the word. You know, we're looking for all of this type of work in the future, and a better understanding of it. We simply can't do it without knowing what's there and how much of it there is. That's fundamental to this work.
Brilliant, thank you, Peter. Guys, is there any more questions before I let Peter and Rowan go for a well-earned cup of tea?
Andrea, the person that asked the first questions, she just put a mention there to say there's a strong large group looking to protect the Ramsey Bay, and I guess this is more for if you guys are looking out for volunteers to tap into the resource via Facebook called South Beach Ramsey Save the Bay Group. So there you go.
Thank you.
Yes. Ant, you want to ask another question to the guys?
Yeah, just one. It's about the eelgrass. Am I right in believing that the eelgrass has seeds? Are those seeds edible?
There was actually an interesting Guardian article a couple of months ago.
Sea rice.
Sea rice, yeah. So it was this, I think it was a chef from Spain, was it? That had kind of funded a restoration project with the idea that he could sustainably harvest a certain percentage of that seed and make a kind of marine rice, which was really interesting. And I think probably, I mean, that's what it is. It's really interesting. I mean, at the moment, like I say, we are down 90% of habitat of eelgrass habitat. So we really need to work on getting that back up to some sort of capacity. But when you look at the potential for investment and uses of those kind of habitats in a sustainable way, in a way to kind of fund their restoration, I think it's quite interesting, but it's not something we're looking at directly.
I can't help feeling that I've seen an email or a request, it may even be yourself, recently about that, and it opens up an awful lot of interesting opportunities. It strikes me of an example from, I think, Costa Rica, where local people were harvesting turtle eggs in return. They've been doing that for generations, but they retained a portion of them and actually looked after them and released them. And just like seeds or eggs in the wild, there's a massive natural mortality involved in it. So a little bit of nurturing can turn a lot of that loss into something positive. And so I think there is scope for if not commercializing it, I think we have to be careful with that. But we've lost 90% of our eelgrass, as Rowan said. The natural germination and settlement and recovery of eelgrass is obviously a slow process. So if we collect 100 seeds and look after 30, 40, 50% of them to the point that they can be planted out, and they definitely we're essentially being agriculturists with them, and we plant them out to the point that they would they serve better than natural, then the other 50 seeds out of that portion could be used potentially to develop a niche food market which funds the restoration projects, or develops a niche food market which draws attention to the restoration projects as well. So while commercialization can have its disadvantages, no question, in the right context and managed properly, it can be a product that can be used for the benefit of the community, as well as community-based projects such as restoration. And in that sense, it's not incompatible with something like biosphere. So it's an interesting idea. We may be eating sea rice in the future. Imagine if we went from the distribution of seagrass that we have now to what it might potentially be, so 90+% more, then we might actually very quickly have a marine harvestable grain. That would be an interesting problem to have.
Right, thank you for that.
Thank you very much, guys. Thank you so much. I seem to have two teenagers arguing outside my door, so I think it's probably a good time to wrap things up, unless there's any more you want to ask Rowan and Peter. If not, thank you so much, guys, for presenting to us tonight. That was really interesting, and thank you to everyone who's come online to watch the webinar. It's always great to see you guys online, and we hope to see you at the next one. So I will let everybody go. Thank you so much, and good night.